evening. Welcome. I'm Stephen Kinzer from the Watson Institute. Welcome to all of you here who are Tim's students and all the rest of us who are his admirers. In a certain way, I feel a little bit of a kinship with Tim, not just because we're both senior fellows over at Watson. Many years ago, back in the 1970s, I was a confused freelance journalist, and I became interested in an obscure country called Nicaragua. For years, I couldn't sell a story about Nicaragua because nobody cared. Suddenly, Nicaragua exploded, and the New York Times wanted to hire me. Cyber is a little like that. When Tim Edgar was a student at Dartmouth and at some little law school in Cambridge, I don't know if the word cyber was even in the dictionary. Here we are, realizing that it is a central part of the world today, and its role in international relations is only going to increase. This is a little terrifying to most of us because the subject is so vast and so few of us understand it. That fact is one of the reasons why we're so lucky to have somebody like Tim in our midst. Tim, as many of you know, began as a law clerk to a federal judge, eager to try to promote civil liberties in the United States and defend our democratic freedoms. He went to join the American Civil Liberties Union. He spent 5 years there, fighting against what he saw as the abuses of the war on terror. And then he switched sides. So we know that in this debate, either you're in favor of democratic freedoms or you're in favor of the oppressive surveillance state. Tim is desperately trying to drag us out of this dichotomy. He went to work in the Bush administration, and then when the Obama administration announced that it was looking for a person whose job would be, quote, specifically dedicated to safeguarding the privacy and civil liberties of the American people, Tim Edgar was the person who was selected. He played an important role in what we can now realize as the primitive phase of American cyber policies. I think maybe we're even still in the primitive phase looking at what lies ahead. He then, to the great benefit of all of us here, decided to leave government entirely and come to try to educate a generation of Americans on these very difficult issues. We now have a professional cybersecurity degree program, which is one of the most remarkable and extraordinary things we have added to the Brown program in recent years. It's a great example of how Brown tries, and in some cases, like this one, even succeeds in being ahead of the curve. We know that this is going to be an issue that's going to define international relations in the future. And for most people who come out of the IR background like I do, this is a terrifying reality because for the first time, we're confronted with an issue that's going to be a major concern in our daily life that we really don't understand. And many of us, if some of you are in the same position I'm in, are trying to figure out, so are we on the side of defending democratic freedoms or are we on the side of the surveillance state? Tim's whole career has been devoted to trying to tell us that we don't need to make that choice, that there is a way to take what he admits are inadequate protections for Americans and make them adequate. There is a way for us to protect our security and still defend our privacy. In a way, this violates the new norm of American political discourse. You're not supposed to believe that there's any common ground between opposing views on an issue that is so profound and one that's going to shape our futures. It's vitally important that we try to shed the idea that we've got to make a choice between two terrible alternatives. If there is some fair balance that we could strike, we desperately need to find it. It's one of the great challenges of our democracy, and it's such a new one. It's a challenge that we weren't even thinking about a decade ago. Very few of us were. One of the people who was the person sitting right next to me. It's wonderful to be in an institution like Brown and Watson Institute that has grabbed onto this issue. And I think we did something even better than grab onto it. We found the right person to lead us into this area. And this book, I think, is going to be seen as opening up a whole new field that will bring us past the love Snowden, hate Snowden dichotomy. We're going to get into an area that's really important. Once we get past the I love him, I hate him argument, we have to sit down and decide, what are we going to do? Where are we going to go? Which means, who are we as a nation? That's what this question is all about at its basis, and that's why it's so important. And that, again, is the reason why it's so wonderful that we have such a person as Tim Edgar to be our guide. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. That was a wonderful introduction. I hope I can live up to some of those expectations you just set. And I also wanted to let all of you in the back know we have our executive master students right here. So it's an exciting opportunity for us for a whole variety of reasons. I want to talk a little bit about two different ways of making a difference. I'll talk about a little bit about my way of making a difference, which was to try to work within the system to try to go inside the surveillance state as a privacy official. As Stephen mentioned, I had the opportunity to go from the ACLU into the Office of the Director of National Intelligence in 2006. That was the near fifth year or so of the George W. Bush administration at the height of the war on terror. And it caused some jaws to drop and some eyebrows to go up among my former colleagues, but I really thought that I could work within this new office to protect privacy that had just been set up by Congress in its reorganization of the intelligence community. So that was my way of thinking, I could make a difference. When I left in 2013, just a few days after I signed the paperwork to finalize my leaving the government, another fellow came along with a different idea about how he could make a difference for privacy, Ed Snowden. And his decision was, this whole surveillance apparatus that the United States has set up in the war on terror is a huge threat to the world's privacy. I'm going to blow it all up. I'm going to take all these documents, I'm going to send them to journalists, sit down with them at a hotel in Hong Kong, China, and just blow up the whole system and hope that one of two things will happen. I think he said in those interviews, he said, either nobody's going to care because it's true that privacy is dead and everything they say about our younger generation not caring about privacy is true, or it's going to blow up the whole system and we're going to get rid of the mass surveillance state, and that's what I really hope happens. I think you'll learn in this talk that really neither of those two things happen. But before we get to that, I want to look at the results of my way of trying to make a difference and the results of Ed Snowden's way of trying to make a difference. And looking just at the results, well, I'm proud of a lot of the work I did in those 6 or 7 years in government. One of the things we did was that we took some of these large post-9/11 secret programs set up by George W. Bush at the urging of Dick Cheney, his vice president. Those were begun under this very dangerous unilateral executive power theory that it's the war on terror, the president can surveil the enemy. Well, we took those programs, those bulk collection programs and mass surveillance programs, and we put them under the control of the Secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. We adopted new ways to ensure that they had checks and balances by oversight from Congress. We made great strides in taking these mass surveillance programs begun right after 9/11 under just the president's authority and putting them under the authority of all three branches of government. We also made some important improvements in oversight of those programs, documenting the ways in which particular NSA analysts were selecting targets under those programs so that we could see whether there were violations in the way they worked. We uncovered significant violations, reported them to the FISA court, this secret court that I'll tell you a little bit more about, this court of 11 judges that sits in Washington to review surveillance. However, despite these advances, I do have to say we did miss the broader impact of mass surveillance on privacy. And the reason for that is that the laws we were working with, that Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act passed in the late 1970s, really didn't take into account the way we live our lives today. It was focused on preventing J. Edgar Hoover or somebody like J. Edgar Hoover from having a wiretap on an American in the United States for national security reasons, for phony reasons. So it set up this secret court to review that and said, okay, we've solved that problem. But it didn't address the problem of the internet, the massive amounts of data all around the world, and the way in which our privacy is now intertwined with the privacy of foreigners outside the United States who don't have, according to the Supreme Court at least, protections under our Constitution. All right, so those were my results. Okay, proud of some of those achievements, missed the broader impact on privacy. Let's look at the results of Mr. Snowden and his massive, damaging leaks. First, we've had an absolute revolution in transparency when it comes to surveillance. And by that, I don't just mean that we've, of course, learned a lot about the NSA because he leaked a lot about the NSA. That's kind of tautological, right? No, actually, the response by the Obama administration and the intelligence community was to declassify massive amounts of information about how the surveillance state now works. Now, they did that defensively. They did that to say, hey, look, we've got rules and protections for privacy. People like Tim Edgar are watching out for us. Let's show you the documents. But the effect of that has been an absolute revolution in transparency. There was a complete end to the domestic bulk collection of telephone metadata. This was a big part of the programs after 9/11. We talk about two parts. One was the collection of telephone records. That's the date and time that you call people. And it can reveal a lot of information about you. The NSA was collecting all of that under these court orders that I was talking about, briefed it to Congress. Everyone was okay with it. Well, everyone except the American people, who when they learned about it, said this is an outrage. We want this to be fixed. And in 2015, Congress came along, passed the USA Freedom Act, and fixed it. There were substantial reforms that were made to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, this secret court I'm telling you about. One of those reforms was to include, for the first time, a systematic process for appointing outside lawyers to argue important issues of law. In the past, the court had always heard from government attorneys who would give them one side of the legal argument, and now the secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is hearing from very talented lawyers on the other side of that argument, also in secret proceedings, but now less one-sided. And then what I think is the most far-reaching of these reforms, adopted in the wake of the Snowden revelations, are the new rules that protect the privacy of people all around the world. In Presidential Policy Directive 28, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, essentially they say that the bottom line is there used to be rules just to protect Americans and American citizens and residents. Those are called U.S. persons. Now there are rules to protect the privacy of all personal information throughout the intelligence community. Now, I think it's pretty clear when we just rack up how did I do versus how did Ed Snowden do, Snowden comes up on top. His way was more effective. It produced much more lasting change. Really, the biggest reforms that we've seen to the intelligence community to protect privacy in more than a generation since the 1970s. But it was also a lot more damaging. You know, and so one of the reasons I wrote the book was to ask myself the question, can we do better? can we design a surveillance state, a mass surveillance state, that not only has the right protections for privacy, but is self-correcting and doesn't rely on random contractors deciding to leak massive amounts of data about ongoing intelligence programs? Well, I want to go back in time a little bit and give you a sense of where we were on 9/11, where I was, which was right here at the U.S. Capitol. As an ACLU lawyer, we had just heard, actually it was the day after 9/11, that there was going to be legislation coming up soon, draft bill from the Bush Justice Department, and it was going to include some new enhancements to surveillance laws. We had very little time to analyze it. Congress didn't hold any formal hearings. We worked back and forth for a few weeks with our friends in Congress, didn't get a whole lot out of that process, and we were on the floor, on the steps of the Capitol, as members came over to vote for what became known as the Patriot Act, desperately trying to persuade them to just read and analyze what they were doing. These were complex surveillance laws. Very few people understood how they worked. And so part of what we did, by the way, just spoiler alert, we lost. The Patriot Act passed by overwhelming votes in both houses of Congress. And although we think of this as the George W. Bush era, it was the vast majority of Democrats went along with it, voted for it, told us, you know, your concerns are overblown. Don't you know we were just attacked? Now, as we kind of regrouped back at the office, we were thinking, how are we going to make this case to the American people? We don't even know what the government is doing. It's secret surveillance powers. That's what makes it secret. So we tried to think of all the imaginative ways in which the government might abuse its power. One of the things we said was, well, the government might start looking at people's book purchasing records or their library records to figure out what they're reading if they might become a terrorist. This is something we didn't just make up completely out of thin air, something the government had done during the Cold War. So this part of the Patriot Act became known as the library records provision. Drove the government nuts. They said, we're not getting library records. And we would say, well, what are you getting? They'd say, well, that's classified. Well, are you getting any records at all? That's classified too. So Attorney General at the time, John Ashcroft, said, look, these civil libertarians, they're trying to scare people with phantoms of lost liberty. Your civil liberties are okay. We're respecting your rights. We're just fighting the terrorists. And people like Tim Edgar are trying to scare the public with phantoms of lost liberty. I remember thinking, you know, he has a point. We are fighting shadows. We are fighting phantoms. We have no idea what the government is actually doing with these laws. A few years later, I got myself an opportunity to go inside the surveillance state and find out just what was going on and what they were doing. I still remember very vividly sitting in that chair, answering questions for my polygraph. They were going to give me a top secret SCI clearance. And if you don't know what SCI stands for, well, then, you know, you don't know. And so they asked me these questions, you know, are you okay? What's your name? Get a nice level for the polygraph. Then they got down to business. The gentleman said, have you ever had any contact with any members of any terrorist organizations? And I said, yeah, I think I did. You know, I worked at the ACLU, and one of our clients was just indicted for terrorism last month. Not the answer he was expecting. So I actually got a little bit of faith in our security clearance system after that, because my future boss said, don't worry about it, Tim. That's work-related. He's going to be delighted that he got something interesting from one of these polygraph examinations. Just fill out a form, say who it was. You weren't like friends with this guy? No. Okay, it's all right. So what did I learn when I went inside? Well, I learned that the United States had set up a vast surveillance apparatus all over the world. They've been collecting intelligence for decades, of course. I learned a little bit more details about how that worked. But I also learned the ways in which that system was starting to break down. You know, the system we set up in the 1970s was based on the idea that you could draw a wall around the United States and say, this is domestic surveillance. You need a foreign intelligence surveillance court to deal with that. You know, the FBI can handle it. The NSA, the other agencies, they're going to cover the rest of the world. But don't worry. You know, what we're worried about is really the privacy of Americans. Well, turns out the world's data goes through the United States. And in the war on terror, this was a problem. We have all this data on all these people around the world. We can't look at it unless we go to the stupid court. That's crazy. These people don't have any rights. Why are we doing this? And that was why Bush and Cheney said, you know what? Forget it. It's a war. We're not going to go to this court. We don't care what the law says. Creates a real threat to the way in which we protect civil liberties, and our job was to kind of address that. So we worked to take these mass surveillance programs that were looking at data inside the United States, put them under some kind of legal framework, and we had a separate set of frameworks for metadata, where you could collect it in bulk, and a different set of frameworks for content. So that was essentially where we ended up. Along comes President Barack Obama in 2009, young, vigorous, hopeful president, progressive. Yes, we can. And he's offering a review of NSA surveillance programs as part of a broader overall check on, how are we doing on the war on terror? A lot of people worried about our civil liberties, the rule of law, drones, Guantanamo. We may have gone overboard with Bush. Let's have a rethink on this whole idea. Part of that rethink was a review of what the NSA was doing. Now, in the course of that summer in 2008, Obama kind of tipped his hand a little bit, but only to people that were really paying close attention. And that is that as we were reviewing many of the NSA programs, some of them had already leaked, at least partly, Congress was being asked to authorize the kind of surveillance I just showed you in the last slide. Surveillance of data inside the United States belonging to foreigners outside the United States, and Obama went along with it, angering many people who supported him. We still didn't know much of what the NSA did back in the summer of 2008 when this debate happened. And one of the things we didn't know about was the bulk collection of metadata. So Obama was really voting about looking at foreigners overseas who were calling inside the United States or communicating inside the United States. The fact that we were also collecting massive amounts of metadata was still very much a secret. Well, fast forward again. 2013, after multiple congressional briefings on this program, where we went up to tell our friends in Congress, we said, we're not going to be like Bush. We're going to tell the Congress. We're going to get the court's approval for bulk collection of metadata. And what happens is General Clapper, my old boss's boss, the head of the intelligence community, sitting there in an open hearing, is asked this question by Senator Ron Wyden. Does the NSA collect records on millions or hundreds of millions of Americans? This puts General Clapper in a very difficult position. Now, one reason it does is, this was a classic example of cross-examination. I think Ron Wyden probably was a fan of To Kill a Mockingbird because Atticus Finch says, never, never, never ask someone, a witness, a question on cross-examination you don't already know the answer to. Ron Wyden knew the answer to this question was clearly yes. So Clapper has been sworn he has to tell the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. On the other hand, he's the head of the intelligence community. Federal law charges him personally with protecting classified information, sources, and methods. So which duty will he will he honor and which duty will he not honor? Now, he could do the lawyerly thing. My good friend Bob Litt could whisper in his ear, don't answer that question. Tell them you neither confirm nor deny that the NSA collects records on hundreds of millions of Americans. Well, Senator, I can neither confirm nor... Well, this is gonna tip your hand that maybe there's something up. So his answer was, no, sir, not wittingly. It was false. It was a false answer. Whether it was a lie or not depends a little bit on what you believe of the shifting explanations that General Clapper gave. One of the things I do in the book is I kind of provide this, we have to be honest about what happened here. Obviously, he lied. This is terrible. On the other hand, this is a dedicated public servant who gave decades of his life for his country. Why did we put him in that position where he had to answer that question the way he did? And the answer is excessive government secrecy. Well, it turns out a couple months later, we learned the real answer to the question from Senator Wyden, and it is, yes, we scan. Snowden reveals his identity in an interview in Hong Kong with Glenn Greenwald and other journalists, and he reveals huge amounts of information about what the NSA is up to, highly classified. 3 buckets that I think about: the domestic bulk collection of telephone records. That was the bulk collection question that Wyden was asking about, but also other programs. Internet surveillance called upstream collection and PRISM, or if you really want to be an insider, you call it downstream collection, by the way. And many, many more NSA programs to undermine the security of communications around the world. These programs have huge implications for the privacy of everyone in the world, including Americans, and they had not been really debated. We had been talking about them for years inside the government. We had been talking about them with the FISA court, with the Congress, with cleared staff and cleared members, but we hadn't been talking with them about them with the public. So what's the response by the government? It's a surprising one. Transparency. Suddenly General Clapper says, you know what? I'm going to become a convert on transparency. I say it's a little bit like, that convert who fears being burned at the stake, but a convert nevertheless. Obama orders the creation of a new website, a Tumblr website called IC on the Record. I tell my students this who know what Tumblr is, and they all snicker because this is kind of one of these social media sites where you're not really supposed to be necessarily looking at such a serious amount of stuff. But within just a few months, the amount of documents that are dumped by the government, declassified documents, most of them opinions by the FISA court, is actually more than double the amount of documents made public through the Snowden leaks. Very few people know this. So many of the revelations we think of as the Snowden revelations are really the Clapper revelations. And going forward, we get, some very basic level of transparency, like how many targets are you surveilling, NSA, using these Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act authorities, these FISA law? Not how many orders, but how many targets. Important when the number of orders is in the 1,000 or so, and then most of those are domestic. And then there's one order under Section 702 of FISA. That was the law that Obama voted for back in the summer of 2008, where the number of targets is over 100,000. Gives you a different perspective than being told, well, we issued one order under Section 702 of FISA. Also, it was for 100,000 targets. But we have more reform to come. In 2015, the Congress passes something called the USA Freedom Act, deliberately designed to kind of mimic the acronym that was the Patriot Act. And the reason for that is that it was the same people who wrote the Patriot Act who were now a little bit angry about how they learned the Patriot Act had been used. And this is my favorite, by the way, a t-shirt from one of my favorite organizations, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. I always think, though, that they're not entirely sure. It's the NSA seal there, but the eyes are red. and it says all your data. I think it kind of makes the NSA look pretty cool, though. I feel like this is a great example, as Stephen was saying, of where the tribes may coincide. I don't think you can get one of these T-shirts at the little NSA store where you can buy T-shirts, but maybe you should. Basically, what we find out is that when we actually look at the issue of telephone bulk data collection, that issue that Wyden was asking Clapper about, it wasn't as successful as we thought. And here's something where I fell down on the job. It was my job to oversee the NSA's surveillance programs, and I did. And I went up to Fort Meade, and I looked at the documentation analysts had of how they were using many of these programs. And I was told this particular program involving bulk collection of metadata has resulted in stopping dozens of terrorist attacks. And I believed them, and I said, well, that's good. It was used in these particular terrorist attacks. A Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, after Snowden, looked at these and said, yeah, we looked at those examples. It's true, the government did use this NSA program in these terrorist cases, but there was no unique value. The government already had this data in its hands from other agencies, which makes you think a little differently about this program. So I fell down on the job. I didn't do my job as effectively as I probably should. That finding really doomed that program. As a result, Congress chose to end it in 2015. But the story doesn't stop here. They didn't just end the collection of metadata by the NSA. They ended the bulk collection of metadata by the NSA. So instead of the NSA collecting all of this metadata, all of these call records, they would be able to access them by going to the providers and asking on a case-by-case basis for particular records, going out a certain number of links in the chain. And the result was, hey, presto, they have access to more data, not less data. Now, some of my civil libertarian friends said, wow, the Freedom Act is a failure. The government has access to more data. No. We can still debate as to where the balance should be here, but the concern around bulk collection is it's everybody's record. Having access to the data is much less privacy intrusive. And it helps the NSA because, and now somebody asked me, well, why is that true, Tim? Why did it turn out that way? Part of the reason is it turns out that when you have a program that is this secret and that involves this much data, the government can only deal with very large providers. It's a clunky way of dealing with data. And once they got the authority and the ability to access those records quickly but not in bulk, they could get access to a lot more smaller providers and different kinds of data. So it's an example of how surveillance reform can strengthen intelligence collection instead of weakening it. We also, as I mentioned, had reforms to the secret Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. I love this slide because, it kind of subverts the typical courtroom sketch that you think about. Here we have a sketch, and what's the sketch of? A hallway with a door with a lock on it, because that's what you get to see when you're the public and you're looking at FISA court proceedings. Now, however, there are lawyers inside that court, cleared lawyers, that are arguing on behalf of the public for a more privacy-friendly version of whatever that legal issue is. So if the government comes in with its creative arguments about stretching the words of the FISA law, there's a lawyer on the other side explaining maybe there's a good reason not to do that, makes the arguments a little bit more, improves the quality of those arguments. Now, I've said we need to go a lot further than that, and the language is right there in the Freedom Act for the government to do this, and that is to appoint more technical experts to the court, people with computer science degrees, with technical experience, so they can guide the judges to ask the right questions. There were major compliance problems that I dealt with inside the government, and part of the problem, the biggest problem, was not so much the bad faith of the surveillance agencies trying to collect everybody's records. It was failed communication between lawyers and technologists. The lawyers would say, we have authorization to do this. The technologists would say, oh, got it, went and designed their systems, few years later, you come back, the technologists say we're getting that. The lawyers are saying, well, you do know that that's a crime, right? Oops. If you have technologists, they can ask those questions better. And then finally, as I said, really the biggest change, the biggest shift post-Snowden is not so much reforms to a particular bulk collection program, not even the transparency, which is a revolution, but the way in which the government thinks about the whole issue of privacy has changed. All persons should be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their nationality or wherever they might reside. And all persons have legitimate privacy interests in the handling of their personal information. This is a binding presidential directive in effect today. Detailed rules in all of the intelligence agencies have been drafted to implement this principle. There are many more details I'm not going to get into in this talk. But the point is, that was never the rule when I was in government. I got some pushback when I said that in an early piece before the book from my colleagues, and they said, well, we did care about that. And I kind of looked at them and said, when? What document did we do? I was looking at the privacy interests of Americans. If a program didn't affect Americans, my understanding was, man, it's not privacy. Move on. Talk about something else. Let's go to these other programs. This is the first policy statement of any intelligence agency anywhere in the world that I'm aware of, that when you're collecting intelligence overseas, people that are not your citizens, you have to care about their privacy. Now, I don't want to oversell the level of protection here. This is a presidential directive. The level of protection is not as high as it is for Americans. There are good reasons for that, but it's still a revolution. Now, why do I have a picture here of President Obama meeting with tech CEOs in December of 2013? Well, it explains why it is that we adopted this presidential directive. This wasn't just about, oh, we think it's a nice thing to protect foreigners, or Angela Merkel was yelling at President Obama, although that certainly helped. It was also because things have changed since the 1970s. There is a powerful interest group in the United States, in Silicon Valley, that cares, or at least cares about what foreigners think of us. And they care for very, very specific reasons. Forrester Research estimated in 2013 that US technology companies were facing a risk of lost business that was in the tens and possibly over $100 billion because foreign companies and customers would not trust the Americans with their personal data because of the Snowden revelations. This was seen as a way to at least start to address that concern. Now, I think there are ways we can go a lot further with reforming surveillance. I have a lot of ways that we can do that through the law, but I want to talk a little bit tonight about how we can do it through what I call technological magic and what my wife, Anna Lysyanskia, who teaches cryptography here in Brown, calls math. To me, it's magic. And I'd like to highlight two techniques. One is encrypted search. This is a cryptographic technique that allows an intelligence agency to query a massive database and learn information from it. So think again about that metadata program. I want to find out which terrorists are talking to which other people. I want to find out patterns of the ways that they're talking so that I can follow different devices as they switch from account to account. I don't want everyone's data. I don't want to be accused of being 1984 here. Well, we can set up a system of encrypted search where there's a mathematical guarantee of exactly what data can be learned and what data can't be learned without giving that data to the NSA. And the reason I have this fine-looking man up here, Professor Seni Kamara, is because he's the world's leader in encrypted search, and he also happens to be here at Brown. Anonymous credentials, something that Professor Anna Lysyanskia, who knows quite a bit about, and created this basic concept, building on the work of David Chaum and others, is the idea you can prove authorization to use a resource in zero knowledge. Now, we can think of this as a privacy protective way, keep the NSA from finding out that I've asked for data because I've been able to prove my identity without revealing it to you. We can also think of many ways in which our national security could be strengthened by the use of these kinds of techniques, minimizing the amount of data that foreign hackers might be able to get their hands on, proving authorization so that we can prevent telecommunications companies or technology companies from being spoofed by someone pretending to be an authorized government agent when the government agent is, that James Bond, who can't reveal their identity. So there are all sorts of amazing cryptographic technological techniques that we can use to protect privacy, and that we can still have our cake and eat it too. Now, I want to close with a few sort of sobering thoughts on the dangers of abuse of our mass surveillance state. And we're all thinking a little bit about the possibility that what we took for granted when it comes to the rule of law and civil liberties might be at risk. One reason we might think that is because of the rhetoric that our president used during the 2016 election campaign. Here's what he had to say about warrantless surveillance in last year's election campaign. I want surveillance, and I don't care about political correctness. He was asked, what about warrantless searches of Muslims? And he said, sure, and I think we need to do things that are frankly unthinkable to stop terrorism. Now, there are a myriad of ways in which you can imagine that in the wake of a massive terrorist attack, we might face renewed calls for lifting our civil liberties, especially communities like the Muslim community that would come under suspicion, just like we did after 9/11. And of course, we still have those old legal theories, dust them off from the Bush era, saying we don't need to follow federal law when we're in a war on terrorism. But there's another way in which I also worry about the danger of abuse under President Trump. And it has to do, instead of thinking about what he might do as a strong man, let's think about what he might do out of weakness. Terrible. Just found out Obama had my wires tapped in Trump Tower. This tweet from a few months ago started a firestorm of controversy and just deepened the feud that President Trump is having with his own intelligence community, what Trump supporters have taken to calling the deep state. Now, I was in the deep state. Some of my best friends are in the deep state. And in fact, it is true that there is an intelligence community that is deeply alarmed about some of the things Trump has been saying and doing. Worried about not just the Russia investigation, but also worried about some of the rhetoric that he's used that seems to undermine much of our counterterrorism strategy, not to mention things like negotiations with North Korea. Two things that I want to think about in terms of potential for abuse here. One is, ask yourself the question, what does this say about the mentality of a president that he thinks that the president can just order someone to be wiretapped? He hasn't heard of Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act or the FISA Court. More interestingly, in defending this tweet, Sean Spicer went out there and said, well, he wasn't just talking about wiretapping. No, there's this bulk metadata collection. There's incidental collection of Americans. There's, sharing of intelligence with foreign partners like the British. All sorts of things that could be done to abuse surveillance, and maybe that's what Obama did to Trump back in 2016. And I kind of felt, bingo, wow, this is the first time I've heard the White House press spokesman talk like an ACLU lawyer. But I see a couple of dangers here. One is in the already existing, abuse of surveillance information by people who are leaking it in the deep state in a way that I find highly troubling because it involves constitutionally protected communications of Americans. And guess what? Yes, it's true. Even Michael Flynn has Fourth Amendment rights. I also worry about a possible crackdown on leakers, what that would do to our civil liberties. Just in general, it's a bad thing. If we look at history, if we look at what happened under Richard Nixon, when there's a feud going on between the White House and some of the most powerful surveillance agencies on the planet. My general feeling is that the risk of abuse of mass surveillance capabilities is higher now than it has probably ever been, going back to the 1970s, because of this potential. The two risks I think of here, the risk that we might face a shift towards greater surveillance from a president who is trying to respond to a massive terrorist attack, and the possibility that leaks, fighting between the intelligence community and the White House results in other kinds of abusive surveillance. So, what do we do about it? Well, find my book. Read it. I have an agenda for surveillance reform in the back. One thing I found interesting was the reaction to that, and maybe going along with Stephen's comments about one of the reviews said I had written a balanced book in unbalanced times. But essentially, I'd heard from some of my friends in the civil liberties community, oh, this is weak tea. My friends in the national security community, these are completely unworkable recommendations, Tim. We couldn't possibly do these things that you're asking for. I think, I won't go through all the detailed recommendations, but I'll give you a few broad themes. First is we need even more transparency. If we want to make sure that we don't have these kinds of massive destabilizing leaks, let's make sure that we learn from our mistakes that we made leading up to Snowden. We've already done some of that, but I think we need to do more, and I think it needs to be more systemic and less tactical. It needs to have a lasting cultural change in the intelligence community. It's a basic principle of cryptography that keeping a system secret does not make it more secure. It makes it less secure. You do need to keep the key secret, but everything else about it should be open. That's the kind of attitude we should have towards our intelligence capabilities. What we're doing should be known. Exactly who we're doing it to shouldn't be known. And we can have a democratic debate about that. We need to have laws and not just presidential directives that respect everyone's privacy. One thing I've been disappointed in this year's debate over the FISA Amendments Act, that law that Obama voted for in 2008, is that we're continuing to have a debate only about the rights of Americans. Well, guess what? That law is not mostly about the rights of Americans. It's mostly about the rights of everybody else. And the idea that we can protect Americans only and leave everybody else unprotected just doesn't work. It's not a workable theory. It leaves all of us worse off. Germany can teach us something in this respect. Their surveillance reform goes further than ours did because it actually enacts some of these protections for external surveillance in law. The one other country in the world that has done this, but they've gone a little farther. And then finally, use some of this technology I was talking about. We have amazing capabilities. And this is an area where we had thought about doing it in the wake of Snowden, and for a variety of reasons just didn't happen. Many of these technologies are not that new. They were explored 20 years ago or more. We can start deploying them in real life situations. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. So we have some time, I think, for questions. I assume that there are some people that want to ask questions, so fire away.
Tim, this is actually a microphone.
Oh, that's a microphone.
This is a microphone.
That is a very cleverly disguised microphone that shows that we're obviously, that could be very useful to some
And it can be
agencies
gently
that I know.
tossed around to your neighbor.
Here we go.
Do I stand up with this? I mean, it's an awkward microphone. So part of my question for you is in the portrayal of Edward Snowden still as someone who was actually primarily concerned with privacy rights. So in light of what we have seen with the election of 2016 and 17, the compromise of U.S. systems by Russia, clearly demonstrating their understanding of our culture and their ability to manipulate our emotions. And the fact that he is currently residing in Russia, and per the DOD, sorry, it was on my phone, the DOD's own assessment of the damage caused by Snowden, revealing that many documents that he possessed had nothing to do with privacy and everything to do with U.S. capabilities to give to a foreign state. Do you not see the likelihood that he is, in fact, actually, or was a spy?
So there is a strong suspicion among many of my former colleagues on these lines. I'd say that the evidence on this is actually quite thin. There's a book out, How America Lost Its Secrets. Didn't get particularly good reviews, basically because, think about it for a minute, the Russians have penetrated our intelligence agencies many times in the past. In general, they don't take people and there's just no evidence of that, really. If there is, fine. Let's have that. I guess the way that I respond to that is that I think a lot of people would like to think that, but I don't see any information to show that it's true. I think, you know, Snowden seems like someone who is what he says he is, and ultimately. You know, the question is for us, what do we want to do about the information that was revealed? Now, just to be clear about what he took and exactly how it happened, he downloaded a large number of files that I think it's pretty clear he didn't fully understand. He did not send them to Julian Assange to be posted on the WikiLeaks, which would have been the kind of thing you would expect him to do if he were acting for the Russians. Instead, he took them with him and shared them with very well-known and respected journalists, told them, don't upload all these documents without carefully looking at them. The number of documents that have actually been published by those journalists is, I think, roughly 1,400 now, out of the roughly 50,000 he stole, sometimes with redactions. Now, don't get me wrong here. There's no one I know who has ever held a security clearance that thinks this is responsible behavior, except for Glenn Greenwald, who said it was responsible, of course. So this is not the action of somebody who is trying to cause maximum harm. Somebody who's trying to cause maximum harm would just take all the documents and dump them on the internet, or perhaps sell them to a foreign power. Ultimately speaking, though, what I'm really focused on is the effect of those leaks, the effect of that conversation that we had. Attorney General Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General when Snowden was charged criminally with theft of classified information, for which I think it's pretty obvious that he's guilty, said after he left office that he thought that Edward Snowden did a public service by allowing us to have the debate that we had. Now, he went on to say that he thinks that he should be prosecuted, that the damage was also very great. So I just don't see him in those black and white terms. It would be nice to kind of put him into the box of traitor and say we don't have to worry about anything he's talking about because he's a traitor. Just as it would be nice for some of my civil libertarian friends to put him in the box of this was a great whistleblower uncovering all of the malicious things that we were doing. And I just see him as a more complicated figure.
But you... sorry, in your own example for what would define him as a spy is selling it state secrets. That's exactly what the DOD is accusing him of doing.
No, they didn't accuse him of selling the secrets.
But why
and also that assessment, you know, I think one of the things that has been a real disservice that the government has done in that damage assessment about Snowden, they make claims that are unsupported by anything that they're willing to declassify. They say, you know, here's the damage that was caused by Snowden. 30 pages of blacked out material. I mean, you know, we need a responsible assessment of the damage caused by Snowden. I would welcome that, and we haven't had it.
Yeah. I'm wondering if you can speak more about the protections that have been enhanced in the FISA court in the last few years. Particularly, you mentioned like the new like adversarial advocate, I guess, but I'm wondering if you think it goes far enough. I wrote like a brief paper on it in high school, and I remember seeing some of the figures about how many warrants like came across the court and how many actually turned down. It was like 20, and it just seems like, should they release those figures more? Should Congress have more oversight?
Yes.
That kind of thing.
Yes to all of that. And one of the great examples of where transparency is desperately needed is to understand that approval rate in a more nuanced way. The approval rate is extremely high. If you look at the entire course of the FISA court's existence from 1978 all the way to the present day, it's in the excess of 99.9%. Now, the problem with that figure is that it is misleading. And the reason it's misleading is that it's essentially a non-adversarial process and always has been. As a result, the lawyers at the FISA court who review these applications before they even get to the judges often go back to the Justice Department and say, you know, we don't think this is going to get approved. We think you need more information. Give them all of that back and forth is not included in those figures. That's just counted as an approval. There was an interesting sort of unscientific 3-month study that one of the FISA court judges did in 2013 to say, well, what if I track, you know, what are the, you know, of the applications we receive, how many of them do we just sail right through, and how many of them do we go back and forth with the Justice Department for some period of time? The answer there was something like 75%. That's a much more reasonable rate. Now, whose fault is it that the public has this impression? I'll be very, it's the government's fault. Yeah, this information was required by law to be published on an annual basis. And for decades, the government took the position that anything else about the FISA court was classified. All the other things that I was telling you about were classified information. So this sky-high approval rate was the result of the excessive secrecy the government itself had about its own process. And we can improve that simply with better information. As far as the reforms that have been made, there have been a pool of amicus curiae, friends of the court, that have been appointed. This way you can get them cleared for classified information, of outside lawyers, including some of the finest in the country. People like Mark Zwillinger, who's fought in the FISA court for telecommunications companies, other lawyers who are former government officials or who have experience, Laura Donahue, who's a strong critic of the NSA. All of them have been appointed as amicus to argue. And according to the law, they are required to be appointed in cases of significant interpretations of law. So the FISA court has to apply that standard when they're deciding whether to appoint an amicus. As I said in my talk, I think it needs to go a lot further. And a lot of the reason I think it needs to go further is not because it's a rubber stamp. I think that's a misleading impression. I think it actually does an extremely good job of reviewing these individual surveillance applications, which is its original function. That's why, you know, what was the dog that didn't bark with Snowden? We didn't see, you know, the wiretapping of major political figures on phony national security grounds. Why? Because we have a FISA court that prevents that. Instead, what I think it needs is much more resources in the form of technical experts, in the form of magistrates, to do more granular oversight of large mass surveillance programs. Programs like the new FISA Amendments Act, the one where they get more than 100,000 targets in the same order. Right now, they're basically relying on the government to police itself and enforce it when it gets wrong. They need more resources to do that kind of surveillance, what I call in the book transnational surveillance. I think you're supposed to toss it over to her. Thank you.
Hi. This may seem like a foolish question. It's a yes or no question. You don't have to elaborate on it if you don't want to. But while working for the government, did you come across any information that made you want to act outside of official, like, response? Did you want to grab your family and run? Like, did you want to like pull a Snowden?
I can neither confirm nor no. In fact, when I learned about some of these mass surveillance capabilities, the thought did cross my mind on multiple occasions what I could do. What should I didn't know Snowden then, but would I pull a Snowden? Would I leak this information? There were several reasons I didn't. Probably the most important personal reason is that when I went into the government as an ACLU lawyer, I knew that they were taking a chance on me. My boss, Alex Joel, who headed up the privacy office, was just putting it together. I was his very first hire. You know, they were like, really? You're going to hire an ACLU lawyer? And I felt that it would have been a personal betrayal to him if I had acted outside of official channels. So that was a personal reason for doing it. You know, I think also that all of us like our freedoms and don't necessarily want to live in jail or in Moscow or, you know, in the Moscow airport or wherever Snowden's living these days. By the way, I do think that the routing of his flight from when he left China through the Moscow airport, which is arranged by Julian Assange, might very well have been a Russian intelligence operation. I have no idea. I think that the man was obviously rather impulsive and didn't think very far ahead as to what he was going to do when he revealed himself, or he would have done it from a country in South America where he actually wants to live. I think most of us might prefer to live in a nice country in South America rather than Russia. So, yes, I did. I did think of those things. Another reason I didn't is because I felt like things were improving. We were making changes. We were doing our best to put these programs under the rule of law. And so if there was ever something where I had to resign, you know, I certainly thought about it, but we were on an upward trajectory. My heart goes out to people right now in national security positions in this administration. I think many of them are motivated by a profound sense of patriotism and trying to protect the country. And yet, when they face being undermined in the way that we see our president undermining people with the crazy tweets and everything else, there's got to be a moment where you ask yourself, you know, can I continue to do this? And I think one of the things you have to do is you have to ask yourself a few questions. And these are the same questions I asked myself when I went into government. One is, am I prepared to pull that resignation letter out of my desk drawer and say, I'm out of here? That's a very empowering feeling to have, to know that you have that option. And that's an important thing to think about in terms of your family and what you know, it's a job. You have a paycheck. You know, where are you gonna work? And the other is that you'd not be asked to kind of recant what you've said in the past. I remember in the first few months of this administration, lots of people were being interviewed at Trump Tower, and one of the questions was, well, you know, he's not going to get hired because he said bad things about Trump. And it appeared that there was a litmus test of you have to say you were wrong. Well, that's a no-brainer. It's a deal breaker. No, I'm not going to say that. You want to hire me? This is who I am. And that, again, was one of the things they took a chance on with me. No one asked me to, you know, recant what I said about the Bush administration or the war on terror or any of those things when they hired me. And if they had, I wouldn't have taken the job. Somebody. This is the physical education portion of the evening.
Thank you for spending your time with us this evening.
Sure.
In my mind, whistleblowing and leaking have always been two very different things. The former legally protected, the latter criminal. Have we arrived in our country at a point where the only way whistleblowers will be taken seriously is if they leak?
Great question. I agree that there's a big difference between whistleblowing and leaking. One of the things I say in the book is that I don't really think of Snowden as being a classic whistleblower at all. I think of him as being essentially a rebel, somebody who rebelled against the system, and he did so through leaks. And I think that you know, whistleblowing is when you have something inside the system which violates the law, misuses taxpayer money, where you can point to some specific wrongdoing. And that's not what Snowden did at all. Snowden's concern was not that this surveillance was illegal. His concern was that it was legal. It was legal. That was his objection, essentially. And the notion that he could have had some kind of positive impact by reporting his concerns through his superiors is just fanciful. It's not true. You know, I was the guy who was making those arguments. I was a heck of a lot more senior than Snowden was. I had access to the very top officials who did the exact surveillance reforms that after 2013 that they had to because of Snowden's leaks. So I was making these kinds of arguments, and we made some minor improvements, as I mentioned, but we certainly didn't have this kind of revolutionary impact. So the notion that a junior 29-year-old contractor, you know, I don't want to puff myself up too much, could have had a greater impact than, you know, me reporting at the White House, reporting to the Director of National Intelligence is just laughable on its face. So I agree with you that it's not whistleblowing. And so it, you know, one of the questions is, what do you do about this? And I think it's a difficult call. Justice would permit someone like Snowden to go to prison. He did break the law. He did so recklessly. On the other hand, I think that with the passage of time and with understanding the major positive impact that he had on allowing us to have a conversation we should have had decades, you know, at least a decade earlier, I felt like that wouldn't be fair. Not because he didn't do something wrong, but because the government benefited from that action in ways that have actually strengthened our intelligence capabilities. By the way, at the beginning of the lecture I said Snowden thought he would either, no one would care, or we would blow up the mass surveillance state. The reality is neither of those things happened. He strengthened the mass surveillance state. And I don't say that as a diss on him. I say that as someone who thinks that these capabilities have a serious impact on our privacy, but that are also sometimes necessary to protect our security. I think there's some more questions in the back, or maybe up here first.
Sorry.
Sure.
A great talk. Thank you very much. I'm curious, in your research, did you see any glaring organizational issues with the NSA itself that might inhibit the types of reforms that you're seeking to kind of advocate?
Well, I think they inhibit the ability of organizations like the NSA to seriously contemplate some of these reforms because of bureaucratic inertia. But no, I actually don't agree with my colleagues who say that my agenda is unworkable, obviously. But part of the reason I don't is that I think we've seen through the reforms we've already done that it is in fact possible to do all sorts of things we thought was never possible before. The existence of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, the FISA court, was considered revolutionary at the time in the 1970s. You can't have judges looking at intelligence surveillance. Well, that worked. And when we put mass surveillance programs under the FISA court, it was the same reaction. These are not proper matters for federal judges. We can't do checks and balances with these kinds of programs. Well, we did. We can't do transparency with these kinds of secret capabilities. Well, we did. So I think you can go farther in many areas while still preserving, and not just preserving, but strengthening the ability of the United States to collect intelligence. Having more oversight, having more transparency, having better controls actually enhances the legitimacy of these programs, allows us to correct them, allows us to ask questions that seem pretty basic, like, is it working? A question that we did not ask about bulk collection of telephone records for roughly 14 years. Until Snowden comes along, a privacy board looks at it carefully and says, this isn't doing the things that the government says it's doing. Looks at a different program and says, this is very effective. So that's kind of where the question is, does surveillance reform work? Can the NSA work with these? Yes, they can do what they're asked to do under the rules they're given. And the rules that they're given need to make some kind of sense in the 21st century instead of being this patchwork that we've inherited going all the way back to the analog age. There we go.
Did someone have a question?
Catch the brown cube.
Over there too. Okay, I had feedback. Can you?
By the way, I'm not offended at all if you have to leave, as long as you buy a book on the way out.
Thanks very much for doing this. I kind of think Google knows more about me than NSA ever did.
Absolutely true.
And now
well,
with Yahoo confirming they lost 3 billion records, and Equifax 143 million. What are the chances of any significant reform in the private sector surveillance state?
Excellent question. Two just quick points, maybe somewhat obvious, but I often hear this argument sometimes used by people who defend intelligence agencies by saying, hey, how come they're not mad at those other guys over there that are collecting more data like Google? The obvious answer to that is, Google doesn't have armed drones. It doesn't put people in Guantanamo yet, yes. They will have drones, they'll drop their packages on our heads. So the question comes back to, can we have reform in the private sector? That's kind of, part of it is that, my cop-out is to say that's another book, but the real point is, in fact, these issues are very intertwined. One of the reasons we had a revolution in the digital mass surveillance area is there was just so much more data being generated by the internet that the government legitimately wants access to, and how do you create a system for accessing it. In terms of whether they have more information, on you maybe. The NSA in 2013 released a paper trying to assure people that it didn't actually collect all the data. So they said, we don't collect all the data. We only collect 1.4% of the internet on a daily basis. So I'm sort of thinking that was going to reassure people. 1.4%, that's not so bad. Well, somebody did the math and figured out that, this was about 150% of what Google collects. Google collects about 20 terabytes of information. The NSA, according to that figure, collects about 30 terabytes of information. So they do collect a huge amount of information. In fact, they've had serious problems with storage capacity. They had to build a huge new facility out in Utah in order to store all the data that they collect. It went way over budget. They had problems with electricity and everything, but now it's operational, and it's dwarfs Google's largest data center by far. So we do have to worry about both kinds of surveillance, and they're interconnected. The NSA doesn't generate all this data, it just collects it. It's the private sector that's generating it and monetizing it. Peter.
Tim, I have a question about the statute that you discussed, the FISA Amendments Act. In prior posts on the Lawfare blog, you talked about the definition of foreign intelligence information under the Act. One of the prongs of that definition, as you know, says that the NSA can collect information relating to the foreign affairs of the United States.
Yeah.
Some folks in Europe feel that definition is way too broad. How do you feel about it?
I think the answer is I understand the Europeans' concerns, and I think that we need to work with them to narrow that definition on a reciprocal basis. So this is getting into a little bit of technical, Lawfare style discussion. Lawfare is a national security blog that Peter and I both write for, where we get into wonderful debates about FISA Section 702. By the way, if you learn a lot about it, you'll be able to guess my Wi-Fi password. See if anyone in here can. My Wi-Fi network is called Upstream Collection. So anyway, I was going to say, the issue here comes to where I wish we were having this debate, because the debate in Congress is all about Americans. The real issues around this this law that allows the government to collect data from Google, from Facebook, from other companies about foreign users and foreign targets is about foreign privacy, and particularly about the privacy of people in some of our closest allies. Some of them in European Union has strong privacy protections for personal data. And as a result of their concerns about this data being accessed by U.S. intelligence, actually struck down a major transatlantic agreement to allow personal data to go back and forth across the Atlantic, called the Safe Harbor. That's been replaced with a new agreement called the Privacy Shield. Just last week, the Irish High Court, hearing a challenge to that new agreement, I think tipped its hand a little bit in saying, they're going to send it to the highest court in the European Union. My strong sense is it will be struck down for exactly the same reason that they struck down the Safe Harbor. This is just sorry I'm getting in the weeds here a little bit, but the basic point here is that the Europeans' privacy concerns have been papered over with an agreement that was drafted by some of my good friends in the intelligence community. And I was amazed that they got the Europeans to agree to it, because they didn't agree to do enough. And I think that the European Court is going to tell them they didn't do enough. And Congress is not really thinking about that issue at all right now, and that's exactly the issue they should be thinking about. I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Hi. In an increasingly digital age, what do you think is our reasonable expectation of privacy on the internet?
Fantastic question. It's defined by old Supreme Court decisions. It wasn't just the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, but many Supreme Court decisions that were written in the 1970s, long before the digital age. And that's where we get this distinction between content and metadata. So the Supreme Court would say that the only thing that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy in is the content of your communications, your digital communications. Even there's a little bit of a dispute that we can talk about with the Justice Department. But the basic rule is the content of your communication is protected. Here are two things that are not protected. Number one, your routing information. So things like your IP address, the URL of a website that you visit. Many of these things are considered your email address, to or from on your email. These things are considered metadata, data about data, like the outside of an envelope. So if you're mailing a letter, they can see it. What's inside the envelope is private. What's outside is not private. Maybe that's a good rule for letters. Maybe not for telephone calls. For the internet, it's a disaster. And part of the reason it's a disaster is because we just don't know. It's very difficult for us to define what data counts as metadata. Does that mean every single packet that's being transmitted across the internet, only the payload of that packet is protected? That's a very, very weak rule. You can learn virtually everything you need to learn without getting into that content often. Now, this is deeply embedded in our law. To have exactly where to draw the line is a complex issue. I think I actually dodge it a little bit in the book. Second thing that's not protected is the communications of foreigners. Even though I talked to you about policy changes by the Obama administration, the Constitution protects people inside the United States, not just Americans, but also visitors. But you have to be inside the United States, or you have to be an American anywhere in the world. That means if you're not an American and you're not in the US, you don't have Fourth Amendment rights. So now think about those two types of data: metadata and content belonging to people everywhere in the world except for you or visitors here in the US. That's most of the world's data. And there's no constitutional protection, no reasonable expectation of privacy, according to the Supreme Court. Now, in one of the reviews of my book by my good friend Bob Litt, the general counsel, the guy who was whispering in Clapper's ear, or should have been, I really wish he had, he said, Tim's crazy if he thinks we can protect the constitutional rights of people outside the country. My point is not so much what the answer is, it's just to point out the problem. This is a problem. The idea that we can protect the privacy of Americans by only protecting the content of their communications and leaving the rest of the world's data unprotected is a disaster for privacy in the digital age. It's a disaster for all of us. And the idea that we can draw a line around the United States and say this is what we care about and everything else we don't just doesn't work in the 21st century.
I'm going to go for it without the microphone as much as I love to throw stuff.
I think we need to throw stuff.
Yeah? All right, let's throw it.
Here we go. But don't be shy. That's why it has a...
Yeah, shyness wasn't an issue.
Good.
But thank you for your time
Sure.
and sharing your insight. Watching the slide over your shoulder and seeing the crypto magic.
Yeah.
I just wondered if there's any thoughts about how that can play, and a question that seems logical is who should be able to have a backdoor access to that or not. It seems like that's part of the conversation maybe.
Sure. I'll take that first question first because from a computer science point of view, the answer is extremely easy, and that's the problem from the point of view of law enforcement and the government. The answer is you can't have a backdoor. If you have a backdoor, it destroys the security of the communication system. It's a basic principle of a secure communication system that only Alice and Bob, and those are the people that are communicating, have access to a message. It's literally the definition of privacy. If Eve has access to the message, well, she's the eavesdropper. That's why she's called Eve. So, you know, basic cryptographic protocols are based on the idea that you can't derive the encryption key from the decryption key. They're based on the idea that nobody else has access. Now, what the government is saying is, yeah, we understand all of that, but we want you, the tech companies, to be the intermediary, you know, mediating this communication. Ordinary people can't figure out how to do encryption, so we just want to preserve that ability to go to you with our FISA warrants and things and get our data. And the problem with that is, you know, that's the biggest problem in cybersecurity today, is that the companies have access to this data. Everything that they can do to minimize that problem increases and improves our security rather than lowering it. Now, there's a cost in terms of access to data, but if we worry about panicking about that cost, we lose the ability to improve cybersecurity. And some of my good friends up at Harvard, that school you may have heard of, not nearly as good as Brown, of course. I couldn't get into Brown because it doesn't have a law school. So I couldn't. I mean, I really couldn't get into Brown Law School. I tried. Anyway, they've written a report that says, look, yes, the government will not get access to certain data that will be protected by strong encryption, but they have access to so many other kinds of data that, for various important reasons of convenience and business and otherwise, really can't be protected. So that's the answer to the first question. The second question was something about, what can we do to take advantage of these new kinds of techniques, and that's really, to me, the main message that I wanted to send in that part of the book, is that cryptography is not just a problem for the government because people are going to use cryptography to protect their communications. That's always been an issue. You can try to subvert the endpoint. There are various ways of trying to get communications anyway. It's also an opportunity for the government to use these mathematically ingenious techniques to obtain data and be able to give a true guarantee to the public that's mathematically sound, that says, we are not able to get access to all of the data. We can only derive particular answers to particular questions from the way in which we search this data. And that is some research that the government itself has funded and just hasn't been deployed. Well, I think we may have. Maybe one more question?
Oh, I'm not asking a question.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
yeah, no.
All right, I think this is the end. Thank you very much.